So tonight's session is going to be about propagation in all its forms, and yeah, that in itself, just this session would give you a skill that could set you up with what used to be a career in the past. And my mate who does Wortley Hall, Darryl Marion, his big dream was that he could become a nurseryman who purely concentrates on propagating plants in various ways. And that's all the meanings of propagation, including sowing from seed, but also vegetative propagation, which is taking part of the plant and following what that plant wants to do to multiply itself and making more plants. And to summarise that would be the difference. If we want just a couple of dozen plants, then the vegetative propagation, taking cuttings and dividing up plants, is a great way to guarantee that you've got an extra copy of that plant. So if you lose the first one, you've got another one. And also to bulk up the stock of that plant, either to plant out a bigger area or to distribute to more people. Whereas if we're growing for seed, then we get thousands of seeds from each plant we save for seed, and we can produce thousands and thousands of new plants from seed. Whereas cuttings, it's a smaller scale, just a few dozen. And in the practice that I run, the element of occupational therapy, which is partly keeping people busy, and also giving them a gentle sit-down job, is really crucial. So a lot of occupational therapy groups, horticultural therapy groups, they run allotments and grow food, but especially in the winter when it's cold and rainy, we can still get on with potting things on and taking cuttings and making new plants. And it does fit in with the growing year really well, that through the winter and then in the summer, after we've done the main vegetable plantings, there's a lot of spare time when it's too hot or too cold to be outdoors, to actually focus on just making more plants. And then, yeah, the aim of this evening later on will be to distribute some of about 100 different plants, which are all perennials, which I keep going and grow, and multiply and distribute to other people. And it's a great way to get started, to have not just the annual vegetables, like a few radishes and cabbages, but plants which you can use every day of the whole year. So things like thyme, sage, rosemary, they're friends, especially in the winter, because they're still there. You can still use a bit of them even in the winter. And also that relates to, if we're just beginning, the advice is to start off by collecting a range of that type of plants that we can use throughout the year. And that's going to give us the greatest value from the smallest amount of space. So if we've only got a windowsill or a balcony or restricted space, that allows us to still have a connection with plants, to kind of relate to them all throughout the year in just a small scale. So first half is going to be a couple of demonstrations, first of which is potting composts, and the second of which will be techniques to propagate, which will be cuttings and dividing things up. And this relates back to the third session when we were covering the bulky organic matter and the concentrated forms of fertiliser. And what I've done here is line up larger amounts of the samples relevant to the sheet you've got. And the diagram on the sheet shows you different materials, ingredients, in relation to their fertility. So things like sand and grit have no fertility, as don't vermiculite and perlite. So these are all zero fertility. They're not going to actually add anything to the plants in the long run, but they'll physically improve the conditions for the plant as it roots. And whether that's a seedling or a new cutting, which to begin with doesn't have a root, that makes it easier for them to push out their new roots into these light, fluffy, physically open materials. And then that moves on to a couple which are fairly neutral, and that's leaf mould and also coconut fibre. The coconut fibre, you buy it in blocks, compressed, which makes it easier to transport and import into this country, because it is important, and that's one concern. But it's a waste product often, where it's produced, just the husk, outer coating of the coconut. And when you add water to it, it fluffs up, and you get a slightly fibrous material with little bits in it, which, like leaf mould, has low levels of actual fertility. But again, it's the physical properties. It's very useful to allow young plants to root around this material. If you plant into a coconut fibre potting compost or purely into coconut fibre mixture, the seedlings would start, but pretty soon the conditions in that are a bit deceptive. It looks dry, and you water it, and actually it's moist inside. That's a classic mistake, but very often as a peat-free alternative, you can find coconut fibre or buy blocks. It's called coir, C-O-I-R. And that, if you haven't got leaf mould, is one alternative. The other alternative is just to buy multi-purpose compost. And there you get bags. Come back to that in a minute. And also, biologically speaking, things like soil, that's decent improved topsoil, which is fairly weed-free. And garden compost, that's a fairly rough one, just a year old. And also manure. These are starting to have primarily biological characteristics and properties. So they're adding microorganisms and to some degree a low level of fertility, not extreme fertility. And then these concentrates, if we want to add, whether it's for a particular plant we want to grow strong, to grow onto a larger size to its fruiting final stage, then we can add these. So I'll go through that and illustrate roughly what we've got on that chart. I've brought this along. Anybody recognise what that is? You could call it a sieve if it was in a kitchen context. In a garden context, it's a riddle. And I've done this session trying to do the riddle of the riddle. And what is a riddle and then trying to be the riddler. But yeah, for all these materials I'm processing myself, the soil, later on the compost, and even the manure, especially the leaf mould, I'm riddling, putting it through a riddle, and that gets rid of larger particles, and they then get kept separately, and that is really useful when it comes, if we need grit, that's equivalent to grit. That's a mixture of stones, little bits of stick and leaf mould which won't break down, so again it's low in fertility, but that's useful because it's got larger particles and it's open and aerated in its structure, and that's really useful as a base for cutting this mixture. So that's my riddle, and I've actually got a set of different sizes. This is a very small mesh, that's just about 3 mil, and then I've got 0.5 centimetre, 1 centimetre, 1 inch, about 4 different riddles. So depending on the quality of the material I'm riddling, and especially how old it is, the older it gets, the more valuable the leaf mould is, because that will break down into finer particles, and that relates to, if I want to sow tiny seeds in it, we're looking for a medium which is the same size as the seeds. So if you have great big rocks in your potting compost and you put tiny little seeds in, they get buried and lost, and they can't germinate, can't push the rocks up above that. I'll not illustrate riddling this evening, because that would really create a mess. So I've pre-prepared a bit of leaf mould which has been riddled. And I'm going to make 3 basic mixes, and just tracking back, if you have used multi-purpose compost, you'll find it costs a certain amount of money, probably too much, and crucially, each multi-purpose compost is not going to perform the same as another one. So if you want to buy 1 bag of Levington's something, multi-purpose compost, and you see how that thing's growing that, the next time you grow the same, if you buy the same product the next year, it might have different constituents. So you might not get predictable growth from it. And yeah, this is also pitched on, if I'm buying in multi-purpose compost 1 year, fair enough, 5-10 quid. And then if I've got to do it again the next year, I've got to spend again. And if I'm doing it on a bigger scale, I've got to spend more money. So it's partly through time, it all adds up, but also this reliability, the predictability of your materials. So having made leaf mould for the last 20 years now, I know that after, this is 2-year-old leaf mould, I can predict how things are going to grow in it, and also depending on what I add to it as a base for these mixes, I'll get a reliable, predictable result because I've used it regularly.